Thank you all for joining today. My name is James Colombe. I'm a project manager at the Federal Reserve Center for Indian Country Development. I'm an enrolled member of the Rosebud Sioux Tribe and also of Nez Perce descent. I'm going to start today with an introduction to the Center for Indian Country Development and the Fed before talking about our homeownership work, including my own writing about BIA Title Status Reports. I want to explain what the Fed is and why it has a Center for Indian Country Development. The Federal Reserve is the central bank of the United States. Established in 1913, the Federal Reserve System operates as 12 banks that are independent nonprofit corporations, all under the Board of Governors in Washington, D.C. Those board members are nominated by the President and confirmed by the Senate, but the banks operate independently, and bank employees are not federal employees. The Federal Reserve is the bank for banks and regulates banks. The Federal Reserve System is governed by the dual mandate: maximum employment and stable prices, where stable prices generally means a targeted inflation rate. Under those missions, the banks perform several duties in their districts beyond participation in the setting of interest rates at the Federal Open Market Committee. The Minneapolis Bank is the 9th district, which includes Montana, the Dakotas, Minnesota, parts of northern Wisconsin, and Upper Peninsula, Michigan. This is the Minneapolis Bank. As part of the maximum employment mission, the banks work with communities that are underserved and underdeveloped. The Community Development Group in Minneapolis works on housing and early childhood development, among other issues. The 9th District has 45 federally recognized tribes, including the one where I grew up, significant tribal populations, and many acres of tribal land. So the Minneapolis Bank has had a special focus on Indian country development for over 30 years. In 2015, the previous bank president, Narayana Kocherlakota, who cared deeply about Indian country and how little attention it gets in the U.S., oversaw the founding of the Center for Indian Country Development as the culmination of the Minneapolis Bank's relationship with tribes and focus on tribal communities. While founded at the Minneapolis Bank, the Center for Indian Country Development is national in scope. Our mission statement is that we advance Indigenous economic outcomes through high-quality research, coalition building, and policy development. The vision for the center is to be a nationally recognized thought leader and clearinghouse for resources and initiatives concerning Native economic development, a respected contributor to research critical to Indian country constituents, and a nexus for Native issues and activity within the Federal Reserve System. We are currently sharing a new focus area: tribal public finance. As I will discuss shortly, tribes have been disproportionately impacted by the coronavirus and social distancing. Tribal infrastructure, including water and sewer, are essential not just for the current pandemic, but for the long-term development of tribal communities. Infrastructure is expensive, and tribal revenues and access to financing mechanisms are essential to build it. Our responsibilities and capabilities at the Fed are well suited to addressing these challenges. Next, I'm going to discuss our pandemic survey work before getting into homeownership. Unable to tax in the same ways as state and local governments, tribal governments depend on revenue from the businesses they own. Disproportionately depend on the service sector,
Hey, James.
including hospitality and tourism.
Could you redo this slide again? Because you froze for like about a minute.
Okay. Do you want me to go back a slide or just this?
Oh, you can go back to this slide here.
Okay.
But just do 3, 2, 1, and then so that way I can cut it.
Right on.
Okay. And 3, 2, 1.
3, 2, 1. Unable to tax in the same ways as state and local governments, tribal governments depend on revenue from the businesses they own. Gaming is the most famous example, and tribal economies disproportionately depend on the service sector, including hospitality and tourism. Tribal employment numbers reflect that. This graph shows an analysis of American Community Survey data and shows service sector employment by tribe relative to the national average, which is represented by the yellow dotted line. The circle size represents the size of the tribe. During a pandemic, this means local businesses and jobs are disproportionately vulnerable to social distancing measures in economies that already have high levels of poverty and unemployment. CACD has been conducting surveys of tribal governments to understand the impacts of the pandemic. This data is from the third survey conducted between September 14th and 25th, 2020, but we launched a fourth survey this month. My colleagues Elijah Moreno and Heather Sopropina wrote about the third survey on the CICD website. In that September survey, of the 127 respondents, 73 were tribal governments, 11 were tribal enterprises, and the rest were a variety of tribal organizations. Because of the low response rates from enterprises, this data focuses on tribal governments. Because of changes in operations and increased needs among tribal populations, we anticipated that tribal governments would report an increase in costs due to COVID-19. Half of the survey respondents reported an increase of 20 to 40% as of September 2020. Another 20% reported a less than 20% cost increase. However, tribes anticipated that costs would begin to return to normal over the next 6 months. At the same time, respondents reported a decrease in revenue since March 2020. Nearly a quarter of respondents reported a 20 to 40% decline in revenue and anticipate similar revenue declines, revenue shortfalls in the coming months, one measure of the long-term impact of the pandemic. More tribal government respondents reported no change in revenue since March 2020 compared with previous CICD surveys. However, it is important to note that nearly 50% of tribal government respondents in the survey anticipate continued revenue shortfalls of 20% or greater in the coming 6 months. Furthermore, tribal governments reported between $15,000 and $100 million in unmet capital needs. On average, tribal governments reported needing $10 million with a median unmet capital need of $1.75 million. CICD conducted a separate survey in July in partnership with NCAIED, the National Center for American Indian Enterprise Development, which focused on Native American small businesses as opposed to enterprises owned by tribes. This survey was intended to get a better understanding of the impact of the pandemic on the Indian country private sector. The survey had responses from 400 business owners across Indian country. This slide highlights key findings. First, while Native-owned businesses were impacted by COVID-19, most of them had retained employees. Second, many did not receive PPP loans and other emergency relief credit, but many others did not apply. Gaps in delivery and awareness for these kinds of programs is something of interest to CICD. Many tribal small businesses seem to be in precarious financial circumstances, with 20% only having cash to cover 3 months of expenses and over 70% depending on personal savings for working capital. Most of the small business respondents did not expect to return to normal until more than 6 months after July 2020. Speaking from March 2021, I think it's safe to say they were correct. 27% anticipated that their business would never return to normal. CICD expects to be monitoring the effects of the pandemic for years to come. With that context for the work of the Center for Indian Country Development and specifically our work in the pandemic, I'll now talk about mortgage finance in Indian country. First, we're going to start with this paper, The Higher Price of Mortgage Financing for Native Americans by Professor Donna Fair, former CICD economist and now professor at the University of Victoria in Canada, where the key question in this research is whether Native Americans face higher price financing than other populations. We have plenty of reasons to suspect this, including limited access to financial institutions for tribal populations, a lack of understanding among financial institutions of tribal law and other features of Indian country, and complications that arise when using trust land as collateral. Professor Fair used HMDA data and looked at first lien home purchase loans exclusively. She used a framework of high price loans, which are defined in the data set as loans that have a rate greater than or equal to 1.5 percentage points above APOR. In the HMDA data from 2010 to 2017 used in the study, lower interest rates are censored and can't be seen for research purposes. Professor Fair then asked 2 questions. What proportion of Native American loans are high priced? And what is the rate spread of those loans? Here we have the proportion of loans that are high priced for the categories American Indian Alaska Native, or AIAN, African American, Hispanic, and other, which includes everything else, including white and Asian people. For the years that were examined, 2010 to 2017, Native Americans had much higher proportion of loans that were high priced than the other category. This is the difference between the blue line and the black dotted line. As an example, in 2017, 14% of AIAN mortgages in the US were high priced, compared to 8% for other. However, this slide does not capture the actual rate spreads above APOR for these high priced loans. For loans that are higher priced, Native Americans pay the highest average rate spread of any population group by a large amount over the entire range of the data. Notably, the other three categories of high-priced loans have relatively similar rate spreads, while the native rate spread stands apart. However, these last two slides don't capture geographic differences among Native Americans. Over 70% of natives live in urban and suburban areas, and natives in cities and rural reservations can face different economic challenges. Here we have the proportion of Native Americans and non-Native Americans with high-priced loans living on reservation and living near reservations. Using census tract data, the researchers compared reservation tracts and census tracts bordering those reservation tracts. So a reservation tract would be any census tract that has reservation land on it. And then if you go sort of one census tract out, that's what we're comparing here. The non-AIAN category here tends to be largely white or Hispanic, depending on the reservation. The proportions of high-cost loans in the other categories are almost identical over these years, whether on or off reservation. This refers to the black and red lines. In other words, for non-natives, it doesn't really seem to matter whether they're on or off reservation. However, there is a huge difference between the proportion for natives living on or nearby. For natives living near reservation, the green line, the proportions are not much higher than the other categories. This perhaps speaks to the fact that it can be easier to find housing off reservation. Natives living on reservations have a higher proportion of high-cost loans than any of the population categories I showed you on the first graph. For much of this range, compared to non-natives, American Indians living on reservations were 3 times more likely to have a high-cost loan. Looking at the rate spread above APOR using those same categories of natives and non-natives on and off reservation, we see again that the non-native category is not dramatically affected by geography. The red and black lines are roughly the same for most of this period. Native Americans with high-priced loans on bordering tracts, the green line, pay higher interest rates than non-natives in either case, and natives on reservation pay the highest average rate spread of any population I've shown you today. What does this mean for natives living on the reservation? For a 30-year mortgage in 2016, the difference in rate spread for natives and non-natives on reservations with high-priced loans, the gap between the blue line and the black line, translates to an additional $107,000 in interest the native pays over the life of the mortgage. This discrepancy would seriously undermine homeownership as a tool for wealth building in Indian country. Here are some important findings from the study. Native Americans on reservations face higher interest rates on home loans, almost 2 points higher for those loans that are high cost. 25 to 35% of the higher interest rate is attributable to those loans being for manufactured housing. This means that one of the supposedly most affordable options for housing is actually costing Native peoples more. CACD has also found in a previous study that the manufactured housing loan market for natives is highly concentrated, and natives applying for manufactured home loans face very high denial rates. These issues must be addressed if manufactured housing is to play a positive role in Indian country wealth building. CICD has been able to access HMDA data from 2018 as well. This data is in a different format that includes credit score, address, loan term, property value, debt to income ratio, and origination fees. For manufactured homes, the new HMDA data also includes property interest and the collateral used. For the 2018 data, the interest rates are not censored if they are less than 1.5 points above APOR. This means that we can see the entire range of interest rates rather than only those for high-priced loans. Here we have a breakdown of AIAN and white on and off reservation. While the lines are close to the first 3 quintiles, where the lowest interest rates paid are on the left and the highest rates paid are on the right, the average for Native Americans paying the highest rates for mortgages blows up around the 70th percentile. In these preliminary results, some Native Americans are paying mortgage rates in a different regime. Furthermore, the gaps between the other lines on this graph can seem small, but also can amount to 1/4 point or so. This is the manufactured home subset of the data. Natives living on reservation pay very high rates across the board, and natives living near reservations begin to see a large disadvantage starting at the 3rd quintile. Again, this means that the affordability of manufactured homes is an advantage in building native wealth and bringing much needed housing to Native Americans is potentially seriously undermined by the interest rates paid by natives for home financing. Here we have an average interest rate and property value plotted by tribal nation, where the circle size is the number of loans per 1,000 people. Onondaga is the largest at 6 per 1,000. Many of these loans are at relatively high rates, and some are at extremely high rates. We are hoping to access the confidential 2018 HMDA data eventually, which would give us exact addresses that we can use to better determine the location of native borrowers. We also want to consider nation-specific factors that contribute to mortgage rates, including the laws and institutions of tribal governments. Overall, we are excited about the new directions we will be able to pursue with the expanded HMDA data. I'll now transition to my own writing about tribal trust land. Title Status Reports, or TSRs, which are prepared by the Department of the Interior, are widely reported to slow down home mortgages on tribal land. This is a long-standing problem, and we have proposed solutions based on conversations with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, lenders, and our partners working in tribal homeownership and land issues, including the Indian Land Tenure Foundation. I'm going to define title status reports, or TSRs. Sometimes even tribes and lenders that specialize in Indian country can find this issue confusing. The Bureau of Indian Affairs plays a role in managing over 50 million acres of tribal trust land. Legally, this land is held in trust by the federal government for the benefit of tribal nations and individual Native Americans. As a result, the ultimate responsibility for trust land title recording is with the federal government. The BIA uses the Trust Asset and Accounting Management System, or TAMS, to generate TSRs, which cover legal descriptions, liens, transactions, and all other supporting documents for a tract of tribal trust land. The BIA describes their own function as, quote, similar to recording at a county recording office. There are 3 kinds of TSRs. Informational TSRs are printed directly from TAMS without additional verification. These TSRs can generally be readily accessed as soon as you can get someone at the Bureau to print one for you. First certified TSRs record the tribal lease to the home buyer and are required by mortgage lenders. The final certified TSR, also known as a second certified TSR, records the mortgage and is necessary to sell the mortgage into the secondary market. Thus, both first and final certified TSRs are essential to the trust land homeownership process. The issue that I wrote about is that extended delays in the delivery of both first and final certified TSRs disrupt the home mortgage lending process for Native Americans. I had a Senate Committee on Indian Affairs hearing in October 2019 where CACD also testified. Councilman Nate Mount from the Fort Belknap Indian community in Montana testified that tribal members there have waited for over a year for certified TSRs. Put another way, while the average national time for a mortgage to close in the United States is around 6 weeks, for trust land, title alone can take over a year. The result is discouraged homebuyers, frustrated lenders who are less likely to pursue Indian country markets, and a barrier overall to additional housing stock in Indian country. The federal government has acknowledged the timely delivery of certified TSRs as a concern for tribal homeownership since the Clinton administration, with multiple memos from the BIA attempting to address the issue over the last 25 years. However, reports of delayed TSRs and the lack of transparency in the timeline continue. This bureaucratic failure is ultimately an equity issue for Native Americans attempting to unlock the full economic potential of their land. How can we solve this problem? The goal of any BIA land management reform should be to achieve efficient and reliable processes for developing trust land. BIA offices should understand the importance of their role in supporting tribal communities and economic development. With respect to homeownership, the BIA should strive for equity for individual Native Americans and for tribal nations pursuing residential land development and trust land mortgage financing. That is, BIA processes, including the production of certified TSRs, should match industry standards for home loans on fee simple land nationwide. CACD recommends the following actions to improve the BIA's TSR process. And I look forward to discussing your experience with this issue at the end of my presentation. First, we want to point out that the BIA is a large organization with many offices. Some of those offices already process TSRs in a timely manner. Whatever solution is implemented to fix this issue nationally, we don't want to hurt regional performance that tribes already consider adequate or good. The BIA should regularly report on TSR timelines. Unless we can know which offices are having issues and how long those specific processing times are, we aren't going to be able to identify best practices or the ultimate causes of delays. The BIA has already committed to a 30-day or shorter timeline for TSRs and internal memos and procedures. Bringing the entire organization into compliance with its own deadlines would be a major improvement. One possibility is to require the BIA meet those deadlines in statute, but it is unclear how to effectively enforce a statutory deadline. The BIA mortgage process should be a 21st century process. There should be an electronic portal for the submission and tracking of all mortgage-related documents. Borrowers and lenders should have transparency about BIA processes. The real goal of this work is to increase housing stock and homeownership in Indian country. Along these lines, we support an interagency report card that tracks the delivery of TSRs as well as federal housing products from the USDA, VA, and HUD to identify problems and increase accountability in a collaborative fashion across federal agencies. Finally, the BIA should consider centralizing mortgage processing. Some bureau offices only rarely receive mortgage applications. Centralized expertise would relieve this burden on regional BIA staff while also potentially increasing transparency by providing borrowers and lenders with a single office where questions can be directed. Again, the issue of TSRs and homeownership is about tribal nations and Native Americans having administrative equity and access to capital. The management of tribal lands by the federal government is a centuries-old issue, and TSRs are just one of many concerns the tribe have. With that, I want to thank you for listening. I want to especially thank the Indian Land Tenure Foundation for inviting me and for hosting this conference. I want to thank Dr. Donna Fair and Laura Cataneo, a research assistant at the Federal Reserve, for their work on mortgage rates for Native Americans. The entirety of the Center for Indian Country Development team, based in the Minneapolis Fed, our partners, National Center for American Indian Enterprise Development, for their help with the survey. Of course, all of our tribal governments and small businesses that responded to our surveys. And with that, I'm ready to take questions.